Hello everybody. I know I haven't really made a video in a while, but I definitely haven't stopped looking into a lot of this the Native American stuff as I have been doing. And I just figured I'd kind of go over a handful of things that I'd figured out. Moreover, I have a couple of corrections to some things that I've said before. I haven't filled in all the holes in my understanding of things, but I have learned I have figured out some pretty important information. I've also been able to get a chance to look into the other two settlement areas that I'd wanted to talk about: the French settlement on the Mississippi River and the Spanish intrusion into Florida, and kind of give a fuller picture of how things kind of ended up the way they were. But one big thing I do want to say, I definitely won't be kind of talking about anything else concerning Native religion. Now onto the language. I don't know if I'm going to be continuing any of those. I know for a fact I can't continue Ojibwe because I don't have the resources to do it. That book is not a very good source of information, but I have been able to figure out enough that it's similar enough to two other languages that have been preserved, particularly by the same company that made my Cayuga dictionary, and that's the Anishinaabemowin, which are kind of the sister nation of the Ojibwe that I mentioned, and the Lenape with the Delaware dictionary. Those two exist, and their languages are fairly similar and most likely follow the same rules, so if you can kind of easily translate those together, you can probably fill in the blanks and keep going where I've left off. Also concerning the Iroquois language, I have kind of it's a lot broader than I thought. I did have someone who contacted me through one of the early Iroquois videos that I did, Karen Hio, I believe. He's done some videos with the Mohawk language. And Iroquois in general is not like a singular uniform language. What is now the Iroquois Confederacy has preserved three different versions of Iroquois that were kind of the original language of the original Iroquois Confederacy, the Mohawk Susquehannock variation from kind of New York and northern Pennsylvania, and then a different Susquehannock variation through the Tuscarora from like the Chesapeake Bay region, which is a completely different variation. I'm still not entirely sure if the Tuscarora were a separate nation from the Susquehannock or not, but I did find a reference going back to John Smith that referenced that there were an Iroquoian tribe in between where the Susquehannock and the Nonachuk were on the Delmarva Peninsula at a certain time, and their name did start with a T, but ever since I kind of put that information together, I haven't been able to find the reference again, and it's driving me nuts. But I think that's who the Tuscarora were, because the first references we really have are after the Beaver Wars. They found another whole random isolated Iroquoian group farther down the coast from any of the other Iroquoian tribes, living in what used to be Roanoke territory, right on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. And I'm guessing they just didn't. This was right after the Beaver Wars had happened. I guess they didn't want to be involved, and they fled the region for safety. And they're first mentioned like right around the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, which is where they kind of come in. The original Iroquois Confederacy was really just 4 tribes: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Oneida. And the Oneida have a slightly different variation, but Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga have almost the exact same language, almost exactly. And if you're interested, if you believe yourself of Erie descent, they have kind of preserved a handful of words in Susquehannock and Erie, enough that I can tell that Erie is very, very similar to the base Iroquois. So learning Cayuga or Onondaga, which they have the dictionaries for, if you're in Erie, would be almost exactly the language that your ancestors spoke. So there is that. But I really don't have the resources to continue on a lot of this. Iroquois is just a really, really complicated sounding language, which requires a lot more control of the vocal cords than I have, and I'm having a lot of difficulty really trying to follow it. There's a lot of rules, mainly because of the fact that it is such a simplified language that slight variations in pronunciation or order or other things can mean very different, wildly different things from one another, and a lot of meanings are usually left to a lot of words usually transfer to metaphors in English, which is really aggravating and difficult to nail down the names of things. Like, I spent an hour, not an hour, that's just kind of a vague, I spent days trying to figure out Ohio in Iroquois. Here I find out that the word that they had gotten that from Ohio is what they called the city of Allegheny, New York, close to like the source of the Ohio River. And it's really just kind of a contracted version of a word that means really big river, essentially, or big water, a lot of water. So yeah, it just gets really annoying and aggravating at times. Sometimes it's easy to figure stuff out, and sometimes it's damn near impossible. Lakota, I'm having a lot more success with, but I don't know how many more videos I'm going to be making on this. I know my videos definitely aren't 100%. I have kind of gotten a couple of things mixed up with the personal pronouns of when you use which ones, when and where, and I probably screwed up a couple of things pertaining to telling time, because I kind of put that together the way it seemed like it should be to me, with as far as I had been able to see with the language, because there's not really any resources that I can find that actually openly dictate it. So, but I don't know. I just have difficulty just kind of making the videos in doing things where I have to talk out loud in the place where I live. I live in an apartment building with thin walls, and I'm just not a very social person. But anyway, going beyond that, I did want there is one more thing I wanted to kind of correct. Wampanoag. Now, even though I have said that the Wampanoag were an Abenaki nation, the word Abenaki, coming from Wabanaki, is actually derivative from them. They're not actually the same as the other Abenakis. They appear, from everything I've read, to have been much more in line with the Lenape people. and of course the Lenape sister nation that I never really got into mentioning. They were a tribe that lived on the Hudson River primarily, who were known as the Mohicans or the Mohicans. I'm sure you've heard of them, the last of the Mohicans, for instance. They didn't go with the rest of the Lenape. They kind of somehow ended up in Wisconsin somehow. I don't even know, but this is pretty much why when I was bringing up King Philip's War, the other Abenakis really didn't want to work with the Wampanoag, but some of the first people who joined under King Philip were Lenape and Mohican tribes. Basically, from everything I can see, they'd organized their government in the same way that the Abenakis and the Iroquois had, but they lived in the manner that the Lenape did. They had kind of the same cultural group as the Lenape did. Well, it seems like among the Abenakis and Iroquois, men and women were equal. Among the Wampanoag, women were the superior gender, which is the Lenape thing. They didn't live in fortified villages, but they did live in permanent settlements with these big open farms. So that's kind of how that's set up. And they also worship the religion of the Manitou, which I've brought up with the Ojibwe. The Lenape apparently also worshipped the Manitou, and so did the Wampanoag. But so going forward from that, then there's the thing about the Beaver Wars. I did figure out more concerning that. It seems like very early on in the 1600s, when all of this, the colonization of the East Coast really started going well, the Iroquois really wanted to solidify trade with the Europeans, made themselves overly available. It even appears that the Mohawk actually conquered a swathe of space up the south side of the St. Lawrence River. That whole section of Canada that's like north of Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, that you always kind of look at and wonder why that's not a part of the United States. There were other Iroquois tribes there, and it's believed the Mohawk cleared them out, and then from all historical standards, they did that after the French made contact in the St. Lawrence River region. They never settled it, but they wouldn't let anyone else settle there either, and then they simply just kind of evacuated the area and let it go the minute that the whites arrived in that region. So it appears that they were really working hard to kind of establish themselves as a trading partner with the whites. They were also threatening the Abenakis and the Wampanoag and the Lenape peoples not to trade with the whites. They were kind of very strict on that. They would go into like extreme war crime mode every time people violated their rules, and they even perpetrated a lot of those acts against whites themselves. If they encroached too much into their territory, which they did a couple of times, they tried to establish Catholic monasteries, and the Mohawks and other Iroquois peoples simply kind of broke into the place and killed everybody and burned it down because they didn't want it there, even assuming some of their own people were living in those monasteries. But essentially they were kind of policing that, and that is how the Beaver Wars started. But I've also mentioned that there was kind of a lot of different Iroquois tribes. Now it was mainly the Mohawk, the Iroquois Confederacy, and the Susquehannock were cornering trade primarily with the French and the Dutch. And they were actually going well out of their way, and the Wyandot, who were kind of still north of Lake Ontario at that point. And those four were going out of their way to convince those people not to go further inland to trade with the other Iroquois, the Erie, the Petun, the Chinatan, and the Huron. Even going so far as kind of making up stories. For instance, they claimed the Erie they didn't like outsiders, and they used poisoned weapons to kind of discourage people from crossing the Appalachian Mountains, and kind of things of that nature. But before whites arrived, they had created all of these really overcomplicated treaties that gave each of the different tribes their sovereignty by solidifying their control of the trade of a certain item that all the tribes needed. For instance, one would focus mainly on flint for crafting the right kind of flint for crafting weapons. The Susquehannock appeared to have cornered marijuana. I read like a lot of things about them primarily growing hemp more than anything else, so I guess they were cornering the marijuana market, and they were one of the bigger Iroquois groups too, so I guess it went pretty well for them. There was one that was part of the mainly cornered tobacco, and they had backed it up with this very overcomplicated idea of, okay, if anyone aggresses this one tribe, all of these tribes go to war. But they would mix it up with each treaty to kind of create a situation where there would be a domino effect that would destroy them all if the balance was thrown off in any way, shape, or form. Apparently, at some point during this, the colonial period, the Wyandot got this idea that those treaties didn't mean anything anymore, and joined forces with the Erie to destroy the Petun, who were kind of right up on the Niagara River in New York, who were the tobacco people. They were like the smallest of the Iroquoian nations that were left, and drove them out of their territory, which kind of activated that domino effect. And that's kind of what the Beaver Wars started out as. The Petun were immediately given safe haven by the Huron, who went to war against the Wyandot. Then the Iroquois Confederacy declared war on the Erie because the Erie helped the Wyandot, and then the Erie tried to get help from the Susquehannock, and the Iroquois went to war with the Susquehannock, who by that point were already also in war with the Lenape and the English, and apparently just Maryland in general. They were in this constant on and off war just with Maryland by itself, which is weird. And this kind of warfare went through kind of from the 1640s to the 1680s, and by the end of that, they had almost the Susquehannock and the Erie and the Petun were almost all, and the Wyandot were almost all extinct. The Erie had kind of been driven deep into kind of backwoods western Pennsylvania. The Susquehannock had been driven into just a very small isolated group in eastern Pennsylvania. And the Petun were in Canada, and had merged with the Huron for the most part. And this gave kind of a very wide swathe of territory for the whites to kind of make it from the East Coast all the way out into Ohio country, which they did not at first. But when the Lenape were forced off their land by the Pennsylvania colony and driven inland into northeast Ohio, Dutch settlers went with them, and the Dutch were kind of the first white settlers in Ohio. And then, of course, a second Beaver War also sprung up later on, after the French and Indian War in like the 1730s. The Chinatan and the Huron, both in Canada and that area north of Lake Erie, made an agreement with the Algonquin people from the north of Lake Superior. These are kind of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, the Odawa that I brought up, but also two others that I haven't. The Cree, who were more so focused like right on the northern shore of Lake Huron, I believe, and then the Saug, who were this is kind of confusing. They controlled the entire northern half of the southern half of Michigan. Pretty much everything north of Saginaw Bay was Saug territory. And then there was a second set of Great Lake Algonquin people on the southern half, which were kind of the Illinois groups, the Eonoic, the Miami, and the Mascouten, who kind of lived between the Mississippi River and Lake Erie. Pretty much everything south of Saginaw Bay was Mascouten territory. Indiana was mainly the Miami. Eonoic were in Illinois. And the Chinnotn and the Huron made this deal with the Ojibwe and the southern groups to go in and pretty much obliterate all of the tribes on the southern side of the lake, and started with the Mascouten and then moved on to the Miami. And this created this kind of huge migration of all those people moving west to Illinois until they all got kind of backed up on the Mississippi River. And now this is a period of history that I really don't think anyone has really focused that much on. The French had actually explored all the Great Lakes and had counted Illinois as a colony of New France. And they had settled it and claimed it, but very few white people had gone there, and the population was still mostly Native American, like maybe 3/4 Native American to 1/4 white. And but for whatever reason, these people submitted to the French and allowed them to rule. And it's at this kind of point where all of these people were kind of bunched up with this refugee crisis on the east shores of Lake Erie. The colony collapsed, and the French actually established forts on the other side. They had already decided they owned the Great Plains too, and they moved all those people to the other side of the Mississippi River to protect them. Interestingly enough, though, this kind of leads to this whole other thing, because this is very early on in the 1700s, and it's at that point that New Orleans had been founded in Louisiana to kind of solidify their control of this entire region, to kind of cut it off from the British, because the British had already conquered the Netherlands colony and the Swedish colony, and were moving down and just obliterating all the land that the Spanish had claimed. The Spanish thought that they owned everything from like Florida up to North Carolina, and this really messed up political situation developed with the entire region between Florida and North Carolina collapsed, and the Spanish just were not able to maintain control over the area and had to retreat. And so the England just then came in after that and claimed all the land all the way back down to Georgia, and colonized it, and drove the Indians either west or south into Florida. But I don't know, it's getting a lot more like overcomplicated the more that I look into it. But I did find out a couple of interesting things pertaining particularly to the settlements of Florida and Louisiana, which is the entire southern half of Florida was actually controlled by a nation known as the Calusa. Now, if you look up the Calusa, it says that they were only a tribe that was mainly focused on the southwest coast of Florida, like southwest of Lake Okeechobee, but they had controlled a territory that was pretty much everything of Florida south of Lake Okeechobee. People haven't kind of, it's not really like a big thing in Wikipedia. I had to look this up, but there were several tribes down in that region, about 5 that made up all of that land. But even though they maintained a separate tribal identity, the Calusa conquered all of them and made that all one country. And interestingly enough, the Calusa were a lot more advanced than a lot of the others. They had actually, pretty much when they had started settling the area, it was the Everglades. And they buried their dead in burial mounds, and that was a very kind of difficult territory to do that in. So they had kind of created these tricks to bury their dead in more areas that wouldn't wash out, in a way that the dead wouldn't wash out of their graves. They had pretty much mixed a lot of refuse, things like shells and charcoal, into the clay and the sand and other things, and layered it so that it would stay put. And what this gave them was a very good, at some point they figured out this also gave them a very good platform for building projects, and they had actually gotten to the point where they were building like 2-story structures. Space was relatively limited, so like most people were living in these big 2-story apartment buildings. But I mean, this culture, they did have a king and a queen, more so, more or less, that's the best way I can describe it, who had a palace with a throne room, and this throne room was a single floor of a building and was just large enough to hold about like 2,000 people standing. And even though the Spanish did kind of go into this area, this is like the whole Fountain of Youth kind of area that you're thinking of from history. They never managed to conquer the Calusa. They kept trying to make settlements there over and over and over again, and the Calusa destroyed them after a very short amount of time of peace every single time. And eventually they just got tired of it and started going around the Calusa up into the Muskegon, the Mississippian tribes of like northern Florida and Georgia, and trying to colonize there and convert them. They were easier because they were much more what you would think an actual tribe would be. They were smaller, they were more isolated, they were at each other's throats and weren't unified in any sort of way, so they were easier to control. What destroyed the Calusa was that event that I was telling you about. Essentially, a group of Erie, after the Beaver Wars, peeled off into West Virginia and Virginia, and they wanted more land to kind of settle on, so they made a deal with the Virginia colony, and they started going in and destroying other tribes that had allied with the Spanish. And they weren't exactly telling. This wasn't anything to do with any hatred of the Spanish, and I don't think they were telling the English that they were doing this, or there was any kind of concerted plan between them, but they were doing this mainly for resources. They were taking things from these other tribes, these Muskegon tribes, and Algonquin tribes, and Siouan tribes, and driving them off their land, and taking things and people hostage and selling them back to the English to be put into slavery, to build themselves up as an ally to the English, and as to gain wealth, to establish their own new land after they'd been driven out of Ohio. And they were eventually destroyed by the Shawnee, but the Shawnee didn't take over their operation. They just obliterated them and then went back to West Virginia. And after this, the Cherokee actually took over where they left off, the Cherokee from Alabama, and that's kind of how it just kept going. North Carolina had already been established as a colony, and then South Carolina fell, and that got established, and then Georgia, and they made it all the way down into Florida, and temporarily had conquered Florida for the English over the Spanish. I guess at some point the Spanish must have gotten it back, because, as you know from the history books, Florida was not originally part of the United States. It was considered Spanish territory for the longest time until the U.S. bought it. The Spanish had never once considered allying with any of these tribes, and they realized their mistake after the Cherokee were deep into Florida already. and the only tribe they had left to ally with were the Calusa. Now, by this point, there really wasn't anything that the Spanish were able to do for the Calusa, though. They pretty much started attempting to evacuate them to Cuba and then gave up halfway, and most of the Calusa were destroyed. They were sold into slavery. None of them really survived, although, and this is interesting enough, there are some vague references that the Spanish were able to kind of create about Calusa society before it fell, in those brief times where they had managed to establish peaceful contact with them. And a lot of that appears to have survived in Caribbean culture. You have like a lot of very specific and weird and interesting festivals in like places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and places like that, where they say this came out of the slave culture, so they're all usually assuming that this came from blacks, mainly from black people from African culture. But it seems like the Calusa were described to have had several very, very similar types of religious ceremonies as you get in these different religious holidays that you find in the Caribbean still to this day. So they might have, at the very least, their culture seems to have survived in that aspect. Now, who they were not like a Muskegon Mississippian people, although they had obviously adopted a lot of ideas from them. They were mostly Carib. And from the descriptions that you have of like how the king and queen of the Calusa were very wealthy, they were decorated with kind of gold and jewels, that makes it sound like they were probably a very powerful trading culture in that kind of general region between Cuba and the Bahamas and that whole northern Caribbean region. But that's all I really have to go with on that. Going back to the to New Orleans, to the Louisiana area, though, that is actually, I've uncovered like a lot of really interesting things from there that people really have kind of neglected to look into. And that's kind of what I really wanted to talk about. The tribe that was mainly over there were the Choctaw, who were kind of settling mainly in what's now the state of Mississippi. And the thing is that they were Muskegon, and what appears to have been the thing is that they were all Mississippian city-states, but very early on, after contact with Europeans, they chose willingly to dissolve their old political system and reorganize themselves into 4 distinct countries. And then those countries merged into one confederacy that became known as the Choctaw Nation, or the Flathead Indians. Flathead being because I found another reference from another nearby tribe in southern Louisiana, beneath the Mississippi River, who were known as the Chitimacha, who said that they used to bind the heads of their infants so that the heads would be flat. Kind of, I don't know, but apparently the Choctaw are the ones that are mainly known as the Flatheads. I don't really understand how that happened. I'm guessing the Chitimacha must have adapted a lot of Mississippian culture, but were a separate entity. They lived a very different kind of lifestyle that was kind of more in tune to the region that they lived in. But the other thing is, you often hear the 5 civilized tribes of natives that you talk about that lived in the South. Most people think that this was kind of just generally those tribes that were in the southern states, and that's not really true. There was really only like 3 groups of nations in that region. The Muskegon peoples, which were the Mississippian, who kind of controlled this big U shape from kind of Tennessee through Mississippi and then along the Gulf Coast into Florida and up Florida into South Carolina were all Muskegon or Mississippian peoples. In between that area, the Alabama region, was Cherokee, who were Iroquoian people, who had kind of been isolated from the others by the Shawnee, and a couple other Siouan nations in between them, and then of course the Calusa on that southern tip of Florida. So there's not really that many people, different groups of people down there. But the rest of the Muskegans who were kind of east of the Iroquois never kind of formulated the same way that the Choctaw did. All of the tribes west of the Cherokee, as I said, became the Choctaw Confederacy. And the Choctaw in and of themselves were 4 of the 5 civilized tribes. The 5th was that Illinois, the Illinois. And the reason that they're called the 5 civilized tribes has nothing to do with their particular culture in general. Upon contact with Europeans, they stripped away almost all of their original culture and adopted living in the exact same way as Europeans did, with the exception of their religion and their political ideology of considering themselves a separate society, and spent the entire colonial period trying to put themselves in the best possible standing with the Europeans and avoiding conflict with them as much as humanly possible. And of course the Illinois got wiped out in that Second Beaver War from that overpopulation issue, although they do still exist. The Illinois eventually ended up in Oklahoma, just like most of most natives. I don't think they're still called Eonoic. I think they go by a different name now, but that they are still alive, just not in Illinois. But the Choctaw, on the other hand, very interestingly enough, they are kind of the heart of what ended up becoming the Cajun people. And even going through they had conflicts with the French, but they never really made themselves enemies of the French. Then when the American Revolution happened, they were all for the United States. They wanted the Patriots to win. They accepted the United States coming into being, although they still considered themselves a separate nation from the United States. And then when the United States moved into the South with the Trail of Tears and tried to move all the Indians out, the Choctaw refused to leave. And it was mainly because of the fact that there is a very prominent sacred site right about the very middle of Mississippi that they all believed was kind of the origin of their entire people and their culture, which is a large burial mound known as Ninewaya, something like that. But they refused to leave Ninewaya. And so the United States kind of gave them an ultimatum. Okay, you can remain Choctaw, but you're living on land that we own, and we don't want you there, so you gotta go somewhere else. Or you can cease being Choctaw, you can become United States citizens, and then you'll be Americans living on American land, and you can stay in Mississippi. And a lot of the tribes, just to stay around that sacred site, chose to forego the Choctaw and become American citizens and remain so. So much so that even going into the Confederacy and kind of the Civil War, the way that the Confederacy swayed Mississippi to join the Confederacy was that there was such a large population of Choctaw and Shawnee people living in Mississippi that they said that if Mississippi helped them secede from the United States, they would allow Mississippi to kind of operate almost as its own separate country within the Confederacy that would kind of be like an Indian state within the Confederate States of America, and that was why they chose to join, which is really sad when you consider that from all things I've heard back then, Louisiana and Mississippi were probably some of the most bold and incorporated and liberal states in the entire country, and now they're like some of the worst places to live in just terms of people. But just kind of renowned for how backwards and annoying they are, although I guess they haven't done all of this crap that South Carolina tried to pull recently. But I mean, the Choctaw have managed to pretty much remain in Mississippi almost untouched the entire time. But going off of that, I've also figured out that the terms of referring to Native Americans as red people was actually apparently from the Choctaw. The Choctaw, in turn, it's a French mistranslation of what they called their confederacy as a whole, which appeared to have been translated to the men who stand together bathed in red, kind of using red as a metaphor for blood, for warfare, meaning, we're gonna stand together as one group against our enemies if you come for us. But the French mistranslated it as those men are altogether red people, and that's kind of where the idea of calling Native Americans red people actually came from, which is something that most Native Americans have been very confused by, because generally Native Americans aren't actually red. But there's been like a couple of different speculations on that, but that appears to have been where it actually came from, that which is one that I hadn't heard of, but it's something that the Choctaw are actually very familiarized with. On the other hand, we have something else that's very important. The other tribe, which also became a very important kind of baseline for the Cajun people in that region, were that other tribe that I brought up, the Chitimacha, or the Chitimacha. They eventually did get driven off their land, but they have been able to preserve an insane amount of information on how their people used to live post colonization, which is amazing. You really don't get this much information from a lot of other native groups. They've not just preserved like where their homeland was, which they know. They've preserved their layouts of how they built their cities, how they stored their food, their political system, different customs that they had that were kind of vague and mainly just not even related to their religion. And the main fact that I'm bringing that up, that they had that head-binding flathead tradition, which the Choctaws are apparently also known for, means that their political system is probably the best representation we have of how Mississippian culture used to flourish. And this is pretty interesting because they had like the same chieftain system that you get on the East Coast, which is kind of you have the chief and he passes on his title hereditarily with naming a child, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the firstborn child or even necessarily a member of his family. The women have their own separate council, and they run things in a different manner that really hasn't been talked about a lot with Iroquois and Abenakis. But with the Chitimacha, they brought up this very interesting fact that the chief did not get to select his next successor. There was the women's elders' council, who after the chief died would select from his children who would be the next chief, and so that managed to keep the power in check between the men and the women so that they could share power equally, and there was no kind of higher gender than the other in a society where they're being ruled by a singular war chief. So it's very and you hear things about like they would keep their granaries, they would put it on stilts up off the ground so that it wouldn't get washed out by floods, or it would be harder for animals to kind of break in and destroy and wreak havoc on it. I mean, but that's about as far as the information I've gotten has come to. I know that there's a lot more to talk about with the Creek Confederacy that the Cherokee formed, and the Seminoles in Georgia, and how kind of that all fits in. But that's that. And then the other thing I figured out was the Sioux. The name Sioux might not actually be from Nadesu. Apparently, when the French first started settling the Mississippi River, they started calling it Sioux-Tongo, or kind of Great River. And with the fact that the Lakota lived at the source of that river, that might be why they're called Sioux, and not because of that slur coming from the Ojibwe, the Nadesu, or the snakes. Which is something that kind of has been speculated, but a lot of people haven't kind of made that connection. They keep wanting to associate it with Sault Ste. Marie, which is on the complete opposite side of Lake Superior, where it kind of meets Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and has no bearing on this whatsoever. But the Sioux-Tongo is that. The other thing is, I think I understand where the names Iroquois and Erie came from, is the last thing I have to say. We do know that the Susquehannock, the Lenape started calling the Susquehannock the Minquay, which means alike women in their language. And it's kind of been assumed that that's supposed to have meant dickless. I think that might have been a white assumption, because I've actually read kind of an excerpt of John Smith where it kind of seems like he's backpedaling from calling them Minquay, or oh yes, they're very nice and strong and well proportioned people. They're terrific. But the thing is that the Lenape had a very difficult relationship with the Susquehannock, their neighbors directly to the west. And they called them Minquay, like women, and I think that's not necessarily coming from calling them dickless, because in Lenape society, women were the dominant gender. They could do they had rights and could do things that men couldn't. Women were the only ones who were allowed to own land, that we know from the Wampanoag. Things can only get passed down through the women's line. So like if the husband dies, all of his things belong to the wife, and she decides who gets what, or if anyone gets anything, with the will. And what was the other thing I was going to say? When you get married, the man moves in with the woman instead of the woman moving in with the man. So you get kind of that vague idea that calling them women wouldn't be necessarily calling them dickless. I think that's namely just like, oh yeah, they're very bossy and ignorant. They make very nice women. They're very controlling, aren't they? But Iroquois, when you're looking at it, it's very difficult to kind of figure out what that is, because that's kind of Frenched up a little bit. But I think what that's coming from is maybe in Lenape, Iroquois, which would mean also women, and then Erie would be Ida also. So like, okay, so who is this tribe up here? Oh yeah, they're the same thing as the Minquay. They're like that too. And then this tribe over here, yep, them too. Yeah, just keep going. There's a lot more of them after that. So I think that's probably where that most likely came from. You also get, there's a tribe of Abenaki that border the Mohawk, who are known as the Sokoki. You also hear them called the Missisquoi, which would, if that's going into the same Lenape, because they did border the Mohican Nation. And if you're getting that same thing going, you would probably translate that out from the Mohicans, something along the lines of Michiquay, which means that they're really bad at being women, which would kind of mean like Okay, they're trying to be like the Iroquois, but they suck at it. Because they did kind of, they built their society. They had the same governing system as the Iroquois. They fortified their villages the same way as the Iroquois. So yeah, that's pretty much kind of everything I got. Yeah, thank you for listening. Heck, Esh.